Welcome to Dominika Best Presents The Deviant Mind, a true crime podcast. This is Dominika Best, your host. I have always been interested in the mind and how we and our personalities can explode, damage, hurt, and even kill the people around us. It's why I've been an avid crime fiction reader all of my life, and now I'm a crime fiction author myself. True crime has always been the basis for so much of crime fiction because many times true events are incredibly insightful and also stranger than fiction. I'm not a therapist, but I do create characters for a living. I'm constantly digging deeper into what makes a person. How does their psychology drive their actions, and how do they affect the people around them? Why did they do what they did? These stories are integral to my fiction, and I'm looking forward to delving into the cases with you. Welcome to the Deviant Mind. Welcome to the very first episode of Dominika Best Presents The Deviant Mind, a true crime podcast. This episode is going back in time to 1935 and a borough of New York City called Brooklyn and the neighborhood called Bushwick. We start in March with the family Gross. The family included a father, Frederick Gross, who was born in Germany and came to the United States when he was 18. He was now a U.S. citizen at the time. He had a wife, Catherine. And it's interesting, but in a lot of the New York Times articles that I read about this case, she was named Barbara, not Catherine. And it took me quite some time to figure that out. I was researching Barbara Gross, and I couldn't find anything. And finally, I did find an article saying her name was actually Catherine and was able to find her obituary. So if you ever look yourself into this crime, know that Mrs. Frederick Gross is actually Catherine, not Barbara. And it was very interesting researching this case as a woman to see how women were treated back then. A lot of times in the news articles, the woman never got her first name printed. It was always a Mrs. Frederick Gross or Mrs. Husband last name. It was just something that really popped out to me. They also lived with their mother-in-law, Olga Bien, who was Catherine's mother. The couple had 5 kids, all under the age of 10, by name Freddie, Leo, Catherine, Barbara, and Frank. And again, 1935, 5 kids, a mom, and these people were not very well off. The father had a job, but it wasn't enough to make ends meet. They lived in a cold water flat, which meant that they only had cold water and a gas hookup, and that was it. The family had to provide everything else. There was one New York Times article that said that they lived in a hot water flat, which would have made them be up a level above where they were in society. But as the investigation unfolded, cold water flat was consistently talked about. So I think that was the one that was true. And I know this seems like a niggly little detail, but it kind of came into the case because it became one of the motives, not specifically the cold water flat, but how close to poverty this family in fact was. By all accounts, the dad, Frederick, was supposedly a very nice man. He had a really warm smile. He was quiet and had a very sweet disposition. The neighbor said that he would a lot of times sit on his apartment building, watching his kids play kick the can down the street. And he was very well liked in the neighborhood. He was a bookkeeper and had worked for the same importing firm in Lower Manhattan for 13 years. And even there, his coworkers said he was kind, hardworking, quiet, and friendly. He had been there a long time and kind of had a run of the place and was really well liked. Another interesting thing about Frederick was the fact that he was an amputee and that he had lost one of his legs in a carriage incident in Philadelphia, where he had lived prior to New York City. Philadelphia was also where he met his wife, Catherine. Catherine herself was born in New York County in Manhattan, but supposedly they had met in Philadelphia and moved to Brooklyn soon after and started having kids. After their first child was born, I could not find any place of where she might have been working. For all intents and purposes, she was a stay-at-home mom, which made sense for 1935. March happened, and complete and utter disaster struck. And really, the big question is how could this sweet and gentle family man kill off almost his entire family? And that's the story we're going to tell of what happened in March and April of that year and who did it. Our story begins with Frederick Gross. On March 29th, 1935, he came home and his wife Catherine tells him that Freddie Jr. has a really bad stomachache and is not feeling very well. As she's giving everybody else dinner, Frederick takes Freddie to his bedroom, undresses him, and puts him to bed. He's actually quite worried because even though Freddie, like all kids, got the random stomach aches and colds, he looked really pale and sick this time. Frederick stayed with him that whole night, sitting in a chair next to his bed. Frederick was woken up in the early morning hours to his son sitting up in bed, throwing up and convulsing. He quickly called the ambulance and had his boy rushed to the nearest hospital. Unfortunately, he died there. I can't even imagine as a parent what he must have felt like when his poor boy died. But tragedy would strike again sooner than anybody could ever imagine. 2 days later, on April 1st, his son Leo, who was only 3, died convulsing in the same way as his brother had done. The family doctor reported both deaths as bronchial pneumonia to the Department of Health, which, again, so tragic. And I know that back then kids died all the time before the age of 5 from various illnesses and sicknesses because the medical community wasn't what it is today. But still, within 2 days, I can't imagine what this family must have been feeling like. But the tragedies just kept coming. Catherine Gross, the mother, died on April 6th, just 5 days later, and she was diagnosed with encephalitis, or what they called the sleeping sickness back then. He takes time off work, this is Frederick, to take care of his remaining children with Olga, his mother-in-law. His sister-in-law and Catherine's sister comes to help the family out. Through the news articles, what I could find was that the dad, Frederick, would get his family to sleep and would go out to bars drinking. The next day he would come and take care of his family again, but he was out in the bars till 4 or 5 in the morning, some neighbors said. So as this family is trying to rally, the sickness is not done yet. 7-year-old Catherine, 5-year-old Frank, and baby Barbara, who was only 18 months at the time, were tired and achy and not feeling well. Olga, the mother-in-law, wasn't doing very well either. And something that comes back later, which is very telling, is that all of their hair was falling out. Frederick, however, was totally healthy and did have his Catherine's sister would cook dinner nightly, and her kids, the cousins, would play with Catherine, Frank, and Barbara. But the tragedies, again, were still coming. And only 3 weeks later, on April 26th, the two families were eating dinner together. And this included the sister-in-law's husband, William. And again, I don't actually know her name because it was very hard to find. That she was always called Mrs. Staub. I did find their children's names, Olga and Victor. In any case, they were all having dinner together, and dinner was farina and cocoa, because that's all they could afford. Frederick later told his attorney that he had given Catherine and Barbara orange juice along with that dinner, and they were the only ones who had that. Within an hour of finishing their meal, Catherine and Barbara became extremely sick, and both of them were dead within 4 hours. That's 4 children dead, and their mother, within 4 weeks. This, of course, did not go unnoticed. Soon after that dinner, Frank, his only remaining child, and Olga, his mother-in-law, ended up in the hospital sick as well. The doctors diagnosed Frank with chickenpox, which of course was highly doubtful because they couldn't figure out what was wrong with him otherwise, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with Olga, the mother-in-law. An investigation at this point had started, and even though the doctors had diagnosed both Catherine and baby Barbara as having encephalitis, which is what they said they died of, like their mother, they decided to test the tissues from Olga and Frank, who were still in the hospital. And it was good that this was actually in 1935, because doctors and the new forensic scientists that were just, all these things were coalescing around this time. They had instruments that could check to see if people had been poisoned. Before, they didn't have these instruments, and this is like 30, 40 years ago. I think the spectroscope, which is what I'm about to tell you about, wasn't discovered until like 1860. And before then, you couldn't tell if somebody was poisoned or not. An interesting little fact was that arsenic was known as the inheritance powder because people, well, specifically children of wealthy parents, would give their parents, who were staying alive a lot longer than they were supposed to, they would give them the arsenic so they could get their inheritance. In any case, the police sent Olga and Frank's tissue samples to a local physician who had a spectroscope. The spectroscope was a new gadget that measured the light a material made when it was heated up to incandescence. And so materials like poisons, lead, they all have a specific color on the color spectrum. When this physician tested the samples, he found a very specific brilliant green color in Olga and Frank's tissue samples. That was thallium sulfate, an extremely deadly poison that was found in rat poison back then. The moment the detectives had gotten these results, and this was Detective Arthur Edge and District Attorney Ferrari, they picked up Frederick Gross at 1 a.m. at a bar near his home and arrested him. District Attorney William F.X. Giogan of Kings County had the bodies of Catherine Gross, his wife, and Freddie, the first child who died, exhumed and had tissue samples taken from their bodies to get them tested as well. Their bodies showed the unmistakable brilliant green of thallium as well. Although, as we will later see, another doctor refuted one of these claims. For all intents and purposes, though, District Attorney Giogan believed that his detectives had found the cause for this family's tragedy. They had been poisoned, and Frederick Gross was the man who did it. He was arrested and questioned for 28 hours. He wept, but he never faltered from his story. And from the New York Times, as I was researching, I found a quote that he had said at the beginning of his questioning. Quote, "I was told by the doctor that something was wrong, that they found some of it in the body of my wife. And Leo, I never brought it home with me. They tell me it looks bad for me, but I've done nothing." He stuck to his story for 28 hours. They finally put him in lockup, and he promptly fell asleep. To detectives, as far as they were concerned, they had the guilty man. How could a man who had just killed his entire family, and if he was innocent, go to sleep after being questioned for 28 hours. As they looked further into who Frederick Gross was, they found that he had no history of violence. He had only one prior arrest for public intoxication, and the police couldn't quite figure out what his motive could have been for such an awful crime. The one motive that they could come up with was that the family was struggling financially. They found out that Frederick had borrowed $180 the year before from a small loan company in Brooklyn. He pledged his furniture as collateral, and he still owed $50 on that. Frederick only owned one suit as well, and he had bought that on an installment plan, and he still owed $17. The depression had really hit his job hard, and previous he had been making $35 a week, but after the depression, he had been given a choice by his company to either take $20 a week or go find another job. Frederick decided that he was going to keep his job, but he had a difficult time feeding his family on that money. They lived in a 4-room flat that cost $20 a month. He had a lot of mouths to feed. And as the detectives looked further, they couldn't find any insurance that he had taken out on his children or his wife, so it wasn't like he had killed them for the insurance money. He wasn't financially benefiting from their deaths at all, except for the fact that he wouldn't have to feed so many mouths. And there was another issue, was that the renowned physician, Dr. Alexander Gettler, who was the city pathologist at the time, said that thallium sulfate was really hard to come by, that it was a relatively rare occurrence and had a high cost. In fact, though, thallium was pretty easy to obtain, seeing as it was in rat poison. And here's another aside, which, again, it's amazing what materials and poisons people were ingesting at this time. Now, this case comes up in another book that I read called The Poisoner's Handbook, Murder and the Birth of Forensic Medicine in Jazz Age, New York by Deborah Blum, which I would absolutely recommend everybody to read. It's fascinating about how forensic pathology and detection started, especially when it came to poisons. And in this source, I read about thallium sulfate and how it was used in rat poison, but it was also really good at getting rid of hair. And so makeup manufacturers thought that it would be the perfect substance to put in creams to help women with their unwanted hair. In the book, 100 Million Guinea Pigs by Arthur Catt and F.J. Ling of the Consumers Research Union had written about thallium in cosmetics, and that it was put in depilatory creams that were essentially being advertised in Vogue, and they were maiming women. One woman said she lost all of her hair, except for a very small fringe at the back. Another woman had applied the cream to her upper lip, and she lost the use of her legs. And another woman lost her vision. And meanwhile, while this is happening, it's still getting advertised in Vogue as a perfect way to get rid of hair and also having a pale, beautiful complexion, because that's what women need, no hair and a pale complexion. When I read that, that was just crazy. And another quote that I read from The Poisoner's Handbook was that at the turn of the century, thallium had been used to remove the hair of children with scalp infections such as ringworm, so that the doctors could see and treat the fungus on their scalp. But the practice had been abandoned when too many of the toddlers died. End quote. So again, this poison was well known. One of the telltale signs was that people would lose their hair, and it was incredibly, incredibly deadly. I just can't believe doctors would give that to children. Again, I always wanted to go back in time and see how other people lived back then, but you wouldn't be able to eat, touch, put anything on. I mean, everything just looked like it was ready to kill you back then. So thallium was, of course, also found in rodent poisons like cellulo paste and thalrat. It was also in a product called thalgrain, which all of those could have been potentially used in this case. The symptoms of the poisoning were nausea and vomiting, shortness of breath, and if you had a big enough dose, the death would happen within 30 hours. Unfortunately, these symptoms weren't much different than virulent pneumonia, which is what the first two children were diagnosed at in this case. If the patient survived longer, however, the only other symptom was loss of hair, alopecia. And of course, the prolonged cases of poisoning, you would have nausea, pain, leg paralysis, tremors, and a lot of signs that simulated encephalitis, which again is what the children, specifically Catherine and Barbara, that was what they were diagnosed with. This was a horrifying poison, and the fact that it was fed to little children is beyond heart-wrenching to imagine what they must have gone through. As the police were investigating Frederick to see what charges they could bring against him, because they had to connect him to the poison, they had uncovered that Gross's employer had gotten a shipment of cocoa 2 weeks before the deaths started. March 18th, Frederick bought 2 cans of cocoa for 20 cents each, and then he bought 2 more cans on March 23rd. And then soon after, his first child died. Because they were so poor, they were typically eating only 1 meal a day, and that was farina. And Frederick had stated that he bought the cocoa because he wanted to supplement the meager food that his kids were having, and it was sweet and delicious, and they could put it in the milk. The other thing that the police uncovered was that there had been rat poison in the same warehouse that the cocoa was stored in. So now the police had the connection between the new thing that was brought into the house, which was the cocoa, and also the availability of the rat poison in the same warehouse where it was stored. The problem, though, that the police were starting to encounter was that no one actually believed that Frederick Gross could have done this to his family. Now, typically in any investigation, stories would come out about abuse that was happening in the home, but there was none of this talk at all, which was a little concerning for the police and the district attorney who was trying to put the case together against him. So they had him connected to the rat poison, and the motive was that he was very poor. But then the intent, like even his mother-in-law Olga said there was no way that he could have done it. All of his longtime friends and neighbors that the detectives interviewed said that he was innocent. No one that the detectives and the district attorney could find would speak negatively against Frederick Gross. So at Frederick's arraignment, he had an attorney named Maurice Nias. And when District Attorney Vincent Ferrari asked for more time for scientific tests, his lawyer argued that he wanted Frederick released on a writ of habeas corpus because he had over 30 statements by neighbors and friends coming to his assistance that a rank injustice had been done to the man, and there was no way he could have killed his wife. And as I said before, his mother-in-law, Olga, Catherine's mother, and the grandmother to all of these children, said that he was innocent. His sister-in-law believed he was innocent. This was really concerning for the detectives. So as they were getting all of this, like, no way he couldn't have done it, they're trying to put a good face for the reporters. William Geoghegan, the district attorney who was bringing this case, outwardly to them was saying that he was totally confident that Frederick did it. But in private, he decided he needed a second opinion for the evidence because he started to believe that there were cracks in his case. He sent all of the evidence he had found to the city laboratories at Bellevue, which at that time was the premier forensic laboratory pretty much in the world. Dr. Alexander Gettler, who I had previously mentioned, he was at Bellevue and he reran all of the tests. So he also used the spectroscope, although here it said he used the spectrometer, but I believe they were the same thing, to see the brilliant green flashes, and he found them. But he, as a scientist, never only did one test. So he decided to use a second machine called the spectrograph, who would take pictures of these flashes of light so he could actually really study the color. The lines in the cocoa that were formed in this experiment he did not like. The color wasn't the same. Thallium is this like brilliant green. And he started wondering if the metal used for the cans had leached into the cocoa, because at this point the cocoa that they had uncovered from the apartment was going bad. And he had tested the metal and knew that there was copper inside of the metal, and copper could also create this greenish color when using the spectroscope. So he decided to run a series of chemical tests to prove his theory. So while Gettler was running his tests, the Brooklyn detectives had found books on medical topics, including 2 volumes of Materia Medica in the Gross home, with Catherine Gross's name and date, 1922, written on the flyleaf. All of a sudden, they started uncovering another suspect in the case, but one that was already dead. There was also a copy of Schopenhauer's Studies in Pessimism, which was essentially like life was not worth living, that also had her name in the cover. When they spoke to neighbors, it seemed that Catherine had said she had nursing experience. But when they researched further, they had found out that she was in fact a telephone operator in Mount Sinai Hospital in Philadelphia when Frederick met her in 1914. They were soon married after. Of course, like back in those days with these articles, there's another article in the New York Times stating that she worked at a Jewish hospital in Brooklyn as a telephone operator, and Frederick was a night clerk where they met in 1918. So there were 2 differing accounts, but she was a telephone operator each time since she was not in fact a nurse. So now that there was a potentially different suspect to these heinous crimes, Maurice Nias asked Mr. Geoghegan for his client to free him so he could help with the investigation. And this got out to the press, and Mr. Geoghegan had actually stunned the reporters by saying he was thinking about it, and that they had received secret communications that he dispatched his assistant district attorneys to uncover. And what were these secret communications, you might ask? Well, and this is from the same article on May 15th, 1935. A neighbor 2 doors down had signed a statement with Mr. Nias, Gross's attorney, that several weeks before the chain of deaths began, Mrs. Catherine Gross had told her, the neighbor, that she intended to kill her children, her mother, and herself with rat poison. Mrs. Gross said that she had already bought the poison and that it was slow, painless, and sure to kill, according to this neighbor. The neighbor, of course, tried to dissuade her and asked if she had any trouble with her husband. And Mrs. Gross said, and this is a direct quote, "I have the best husband any woman could want, but rather than drudge along like this and be in poverty, I'd do anything. Someday you'll be surprised." And the neighbor is quoted as asking, "But you mean you'd give your children poison and see them suffer?" This is another quote. "There's no suffering to what I've got," she replied. Quote, "It's sure death. It might take a day. It may take 30 days. And this neighbor also said that Mrs. Gross discovered this poison when she worked at the hospital. So here's my question to you. She obviously knew that it would take a day or 30 days, so she definitely knew about the poison. But this whole suffering, the suffering was very obvious how horrible this poison was, and she must have known that if she had discovered this poison in the hospital. Plus, she also had these books that also said how painful this poison was. So what in the world would cause a mother to feed this horrifying poison to her children and watch them suffer? Again, the questions that I have. All right, going back to our story. So her husband refused to believe this information. He objected strenuously and was one of the reasons why he was still in jail. The paper quoted him as saying, "Yes, I've been told that theory, but it never could have happened that way." He told Mr. Geoghegan, quote, "I don't believe it. If I thought she did it, I would take the blame for it myself." And Mr. Nyas, his lawyer, was completely convinced that Catherine Gross had killed her children and herself, and he was prepared to call 20 witnesses who'd heard Mrs. Gross hint at such an intention. 20 witnesses. That was probably what made Mr. Geoghegan be like, oh, okay, my case is really falling apart. And then he got Dr. Gettler's testing. Dr. Gettler had confirmed that he had found thallium in all of the dead children, but not in Catherine Gross. She had actually died of encephalitis like originally diagnosed. So again, she did not poison herself, which totally changes this suicidal theory. So is there another theory the detectives were looking into? Which in fact, they stated that she maybe wanted to start a new life with only herself. And there's one last thing that I forgot to mention. Catherine Gross was pregnant with her 6th child during this entire case. So she's a pregnant woman who now purportedly poisoned her 5 children. What kind of monster could she have been? And why couldn't Frederick have seen that? Gettler's results also confirmed that the girls had gotten different doses than the boys, which is why it took them longer to die. So originally, District Attorney William Geoghegan believed the father killed the girls after the mother died, but Gettler said no. The girls were poisoned at the same time as the boys, but they stayed alive longer because of the dosage. The dosage was much smaller. Gettler also found no evidence of thallium sulfate in the cocoa, and the police now had no evidence connecting him to the deaths of his children. On May 20th, Magistrate John D. Mason of Brooklyn Homicide County Court released Frederick Gross, and District Attorney William Geoghegan stated, quote, "He is either the coldest-blooded murderer I have ever met, or else he is absolutely innocent." Frederick went straight to the hospital to see his only remaining son, Frank. He made sure to tell journalists this time to write about the fact that he was innocent all along. He also never believed his wife killed his children, and he and Olga took care of Frank on their own, and that was essentially where the case ended. The police said that they would keep investigating, but in fact, they stopped because they truly believed that Catherine had given the children the poison, because she and her mother were the only ones who ever fed the children. Frederick wasn't part of the dinner preparations ever, and the fact that she had told anybody who would listen that she was planning to kill them with rat poison, it seems pretty a shut case at this point. And the fact that she herself died from encephalitis, well, you can't bring charges against her. But what could happen to a mother to have done such a thing? But what about Catherine, the person who supposedly killed her children? She was only 38 years old at the time of her death. And I did some research into what is called filicide, which is where a mother kills her children. And most filicidal mothers have frequent depression, psychosis, or prior mental health issues and suicidal thoughts. And maternal filicide typically have 5 major motives. The first one is altruistic filicide, where a mother kills her child out of love, saying she believes the death will be in the child's best interest. For example, a suicidal mother might not wish to leave her motherless child to face the world on her own, so she kills them because she's saving her child from a fate worse than death, which is being alone in the world. Then there's a second one called acutely psychotic filicide, which is a psychotic or delirious mother kills her child without any comprehensible motive. So she might be following hallucinations to kill. There's a third one, which is fatal maltreatment filicide, which is death is usually not the anticipated outcome, but it's a result of child abuse, neglect, or Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or unwanted child filicide, where a mother thinks of her child as a hindrance. Then there's some really rare ones, which is spouse revenge filicide, when a mother kills her child to emotionally harm the child's father. Now, it looks from what we know about Catherine that she was suicidal because she was talking about killing herself and her mother and her children. She also had problems with being poor, like there wasn't enough resources for her children. And this actually, in research studies, a significant portion of mothers have psychosis, depression, or suicide. They tend to have just given birth or pregnant at the time. Significant life stressors were always part of the psychology of a mother through these studies. And it looks like most times when mothers killed, it was the altruistic or acutely psychotic motive. So they typically, depressed mothers would contemplate killing their children days or weeks prior to their crimes. And obviously, like we have heard from this, the mother was telling her neighbors and friends exactly what she was planning to do. Now, psychotic mothers tended to kill suddenly, and postpartum psychosis typically has an immediate onset after giving birth, whereas little Barbara was 18 months. So I probably am thinking that she was dealing with postpartum depression, and then now she's pregnant. So she has all these different hormones going into her body, and she can't feed her children. And her mind essentially explodes in depression. And again, this is a horrifying crime, but that has happened before. And we've heard cases of mothers killing in the news just in the last 20 years. So this is something that happens. And there are very specific triggers, psychosis and the depression. And I was reading articles about how society expects mothers to do everything. And back then, obviously, mothers were expected to do child rearing. Catherine didn't work outside of the home, and she, in fact, had her mother-in-law helping her out. But I think that within them being extremely in debt, not being able to feed their children, the fact that they owed all these debts for their life was such a trigger, like a stressor for this to happen. And it was the perfect storm of mental illness, again, hormones from a pregnancy, life just caving in on her. And that the fact that nobody actually stopped her and said, hey, I think you need help. Maybe I should call the cops, or maybe you need to go see a doctor. But again, this was 1935, and mental health wasn't even on the horizon at that point. People could barely get out of hospitals. It was, again, just in crime, because the fact that we typically hear about fathers being family annihilators. And just recently, we've had these spates of crimes where the mother was the one who killed her children. Postpartum depression happens in about 15 to 20% of new mothers, which is a staggering number. And I mean, it just looks like this is probably what happened in this case. It was a tragedy. Because psychology was in its baby stages, I'm just not sure what or who could have helped Catherine. Apparently, her husband didn't know. And I wonder if they had a relationship that they could even talk to each other and say, hey, I'm not doing so good. Frederick for everything that I read, swore up and down that his wife would have never been able to do this heinous crime. And I could imagine for a husband, if she actually did do it, that he would just shut down because the possibility was so horrendous. And he lost his entire family to the woman who had created it with him. This case just is tragedy in all its forms. And again, it goes back to mothers specifically needing help and needing to get diagnosis. Even when I was pregnant, I started getting literature about postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis. And it is now definitely in kind of the cultural zeitgeist, but obviously in 1935, it would not have been. And even still in the poorer communities, when women who don't have prenatal care or are just in such abject poverty that, again, these stressors happen. And then we see, again, the explosion of this pain onto the people around them. So that is the case of Frederick Gross and his wife, Catherine Gross. And I guess it's a family annihilator case by the mom, or maternal filicide. Next week, I am going to bring a serial killer case from the last 20 years. I'm sure you will all have heard about it by now, this case, but I'm not going to tell you who it is. You're going to have to wait to listen next week. And thank you so very much for joining me on The Deviant Mind. This episode was sponsored by The Creek Killer, book 1 in the Harriet Harper thriller series written by me, Dominika Best. What would you do if you read The Police Found Your Body in a Creek? Find out in The Creek Killer, available on Amazon. Thank you for joining me and listening to this episode. If you like my show, please give me a rating and review. It helps other listeners find this podcast. Follow Dominika Best Presents The Deviant Mind wherever you listen to your podcasts. Visit thebeststorytellingnetwork.com, where you'll find show notes, my books, links to social media, and much more. Join my Patreon for special subscriber perks, like 2 extra exclusive episodes a month and a Q&A with me at patreon.com/The Deviant Mind Podcast. Until next time.